Welcome back to Buckeye Talk. I'm Stephen Means and Stefan Krajisnik. And we were wrong and right at the same time, because that's what Buckeye Talk is all about. Even when we're wrong, we're right. On Monday's pod, we did a projection of what we thought the top 8 in the college football playoffs, the first rankings would look like. And then we did what the rankings should look like. Our should, in terms of the top 4, is exactly spot on. Or what they will be, obviously there's a bit of a mixed up, but I'm burying the lead. The lead is Oregon's number 1, as we all expected them to be. Ohio State is number 2. Georgia is number 3. Miami number 4. Texas number 5. Penn State number 6. Tennessee number 7. Indiana number 8. Notre Dame number 10. BYU number 9. I don't know why I skipped over that. Actually, I do know why. I'll get into it in a little bit. Number 11 is Alabama, and number 12 is Boise State. So you have 8 teams from either the Big Ten or the SEC. You have the leader in the Big 12, the leader in the ACC, Notre Dame, and your group of 5 team. Stefan, I mean, we were on a call with Rich Clark, who's the director, and the committee chair, Ward Manuel, who's also the AD at Michigan, and they were talking about how conferences didn't matter. But when 8 teams come from the 2 quote-unquote super conferences, I don't know if actions speak louder than words, but is this best case scenario for Ohio State, where the only team ranked above them is a team they lost to by 1 point on the road?
Yeah, I think it solidifies a big a big conversation we were having after the Penn State game when we were previewing these rankings, that the winner of the Big Ten is going to get the number 1 seed in the college football playoff, barring anything surprising. There could have been an argument, had Ohio State been 3 and Georgia 2, that a win against Oregon, maybe you don't jump Georgia. Maybe Georgia just moves up and they get the number 1 seed. Now it's pretty clear cut. The winner of the Big Ten will be the number 1 seed if it's Oregon or Ohio State. And frankly, based on where Indiana finished up, I mean, if they run the table and win the Big Ten, I think they would also get the number 1 seed. It just seems like the Big Ten, if they have, or whoever the conference champion is going to be the number 1 seed. And that's very favorable for Ohio State. I think the draw of being the 1 seed is significantly better than the draw of being the 2 seed in the playoff, right? So it was a good day for Ohio State. I think the rankings were correct in terms of where they put Ohio State. Obviously, I probably don't agree with the full top 25 or even the full top 12. And I'm sure there's some people who are listening to this who just heard that Alabama's at number 11 and probably has opinions on it. But in terms of Ohio State, I thought it was a good night for them. Being a number 2 is a perfect spot to be in. You can't really argue much against that. And now you have a chance to, avenge that 1 loss that you had. It was against the number 1 team in the country. You're probably rooting for Oregon to stay there up until the Big Ten championship game. Oregon should stay there, barring any surprising losses. So, yeah, overall, this is about where we thought Ohio State should be. I wasn't sure how the committee was going to handle it. I thought they handled it right, because you had even pointed out it's pretty rare in these rankings for the top 2 teams to be from the same conference. And when it has been the case, it's been Alabama and Georgia. So for Ohio State and Oregon to get that, not only is that good for Ohio State and Oregon, I think it's good for Penn State, and I think it's good for Indiana.
I like where all the Big Ten teams are. I like where every single one is. Even Indiana. So here's what we said would be. We said Oregon, Georgia, Ohio State, Miami, and the reasons why are it's a healthy concern, right? Are they going to fall in love with the SEC? That's essentially what we were asking. And they didn't. I love that, because the AP poll has been falling in love with the SEC, and the ESPN has been falling in love with the SEC. Greg McElroy had the nerve to be like, Missouri is so low. They've beaten Vanderbilt. And I'm just like, so? Okay.
What? He had some takes. He lost me and I understand the strength of schedule debate with Indiana. When he was like, how is Army 25 when they're also undefeated? Shouldn't they have the same argument as Indiana? Undefeated with a weak Big 12 schedule is way different than undefeated with Army schedule. That is way different.
Literally.
Like Indiana's win at Penn State is way better than any win Army has. Come on,
especially man. Indiana's beaten every team by like 30 points or so. I think, but I got asked, because it's almost a comparison of like, why is Penn State, when their schedule, it's a quality strength of schedule, but it does lose some steam when Illinois isn't in your ranking anymore and Illinois is kind of falling off a little bit. Wisconsin and USC aren't as good as maybe you anticipated them being. And so you're wondering, I feel like Penn State, Tennessee, and Indiana became and even Texas, I'll throw them in there as well, because we thought Texas would be 7 by the committee and we thought they should be 7 and end up being 5. I think all 4 of those teams fell into a resume versus eye test conversation. And I think Indiana's resume is just so scarce that I don't think the eye test can make up for it. But I also think Texas's eye test is kind of getting scarce. And I was a little shocked by the Texas being number 5 situation. I thought that Texas probably should have been lower, but that is what it is. Penn State being number 6 helped Ohio State, and that's part of the reason why Ohio State is number 2, because you beat the number 16 team in the country in their own building. You've got the number 8 team in the country as of right now, Indiana, coming to your building in a couple of weeks. And I don't know what Texas and Tennessee schedule, but Indiana could move up to 6 or 7, depending on what some of these schedules are, right? But this is a great it's a chance for Ohio State, who right now I think has a mixture of resume and eye test. They are top 5 in the country in yards per play offensively and yards allowed per play defensively. We just live in this bubble, so we nitpick and we go deeper and dive a little deeper than most people do. But from the outside looking in, Ohio State's got a quality resume and they've looked pretty good for the most part. They had a weird game against Nebraska, but other than that, they've been very, very good. So you said it. You said what I've been saying since the Monday pod, and really since I've been saying since the game ended on Saturday. If Ohio State's number 2, all Oregon and Ohio State have to do is get through November and get back on the field in Indianapolis, and whoever wins that game is going to be the number 1 seed in the college football playoff. I thought there was one extra layer, though. And again, Stephen Means, the overthinker, Ward Manuel being Michigan's AD, and he was also mentioning the fact that there are some guys on the committee who are offensive line guys. He's a defensive end. You got Randall McDaniel, former Arizona State University offensive lineman. He's a Pro Football and College Hall of Famer. You've got a couple of other guys on here as well who are, I'm trying to find some of these guys. Will Shields, former Nebraska player. He's in the Pro Football and College Football Hall of Famer. So you got those 2 guys. Plus Ward Manuel knows the Big Ten because he's Michigan's athletic director. He brought up in his initial statement, which I thought was funny, because in the initial statement, he talked about the top 4. And then remember though, it's 12 teams that matter, but you're still kind of talking about things like we're still living in the 14 playoff world, which is going to be funny. But also you can't run down 12 teams. It's just, we were on that call for an hour. That would have been an hour and a half if you run down all 12 teams. But here's this quote to my follow-up about just how much that mattered, because we get it. Ohio State's loss just looks better than Georgia's loss. But there's got to be more to it than just that. And I think Ohio State's offensive line playing the way they did on Saturday helped Ohio State out. James Crepia from our sister site, the Oregonian Oregon Live, asked about injuries and how last year with what Florida State happened with them, whether that would incentivize teams to not reveal injuries to the fullest extent, because obviously what happened with Jordan Travis in Florida State. My question was kind of in that vein, but a little bit different, because it was about, you saw positives in the fact that this offensive line was makeshift. And his direct quote, "We notice when linemen move around, when people are not in the games that have been in the games before, we have 2 NFL and college Hall of Famers on the offensive line who are also on the committee and recognize and discuss the play of the offensive line. I'm a former defensive end, so you tend to notice those things." And it was impressive with the movement that Ohio State really moved the ball against Penn State, protected well against their rush. And so that did factor into it as it relates to how we saw Ohio State in the performance against Penn State this past weekend. That wasn't like A-level performance from the offensive line. It was probably B- level performance from the offensive line. That's it. If they can be B- level from the offensive line, I think they can just hold on to this number 2 spot and maybe number 3 division, depending on who Georgia's playing, right? Because that might flip some things. But though the committee thinks a little bit differently, they're not as quick to pull the trigger as you are in the AP poll. I think that was the tiebreaker more than it was the 1 point loss to Oregon. It was the fact that Ohio State has a very, very large problem and a very, very big question that of all the teams left on their regular season schedule, Penn State was best positioned to exploit. And instead of Penn State exploiting it, Ohio State kind of doubled down that this is not going to be such an issue that we are not going to be able to function offensively. And so I feel like in some ironic way, Ohio State's biggest problem child, the thing that we thought could be the death of this team, somehow put itself in a position to be one of its stronger points on a resume because they turned a makeshift offensive line into just enough to allow Ohio State's offense to function.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say that was more the determining factor than the two losses, but it was definitely a huge piece in the tiebreaker because you look at it and you say that offensive line is fine. I think a big thing that we look back on Florida State last year, when Jordan Travis got hurt, they started to look bad.
Yeah.
Like, they did not look good. Ohio State's offense, had these rankings come out after the Nebraska game, maybe they would have been number 3 if that offensive line, their last look was how bad that offensive line was, how much that running game struggled. And then you saw that game against Penn State. You say, okay, they moved some things around. Yeah, they hit injuries, but their offensive line looked fine and could do it against Penn State and could have put up, 100 plus rushing yards, whatever it was, and look just fine against Penn State. It's not a concern, right? Like Jordan Travis being out was a concern for Florida State. This offensive line might not be as much of a concern as we thought it was because of how they played against Penn State. And I think that's massive. Also, another thing that I take from that, because you talk about Ward and the takeaways that he had and just how much knowledge he had about Penn State. One thing that I really have respected about the Ohio State-Michigan rivalry being in it now without having yet covered the game.
Yeah.
There is no such thing as rent-free. Ohio State fans watch Michigan and Michigan fans watch Ohio State, and they are not ashamed to admit it. There's no such thing as rent-free. The hatred is just real, and they don't shy away from it. They're watching every snap of every game.
Yeah, it's there's very much a rent fee that's being paid.
There's just a lot of rivalries where it's like I just covered Ohio or Mississippi State, Ole Miss, and it was like, why are you worried about what Ole Miss is doing? Why are you worried about what Mississippi State's doing? Michigan and Ohio State, it's like, oh, I'm watching you. I'm watching.
Yeah. It's almost like, why aren't you worried about what Ohio State is doing? Why aren't you worried about what Michigan is doing? Okay, that's probably fair. I probably took this. It's not clearly the losses were the number one factor in that conversation. But I think second tier, Georgia's win over Alabama loses a little bit of steam when they're 11, right? And Ohio State's win over Penn State and Penn State's 6, right? That loses a little bit of steam. And the reason why they beat Penn State ultimately is because, as Donovan Jackson said after the game, they had to drop their you-know-whats and go run the ball for 5 minutes and 13 seconds. And that's what ultimately won them the game, is their ability to put the game away. They
mentioned eye test as well. Like, they're not ignoring the fact that Georgia has looked really bad in stretches. Like they mentioned the Nebraska game for Ohio State, but he was like that was the only time this season that Nebraska or Ohio State's looked somewhat shaky. Like Georgia's had a lot of games where you're like, ugh. Like Florida game was not that convincing. Kentucky game was far from convincing. Yes, they have the Texas win, but is that enough to make you kind of forget about some of these other struggles? Not really. Whereas with Ohio State, you can look past the Nebraska game pretty easily because you just say that was kind of a one-off.
And we're talking about Will Howard and any of the mistakes he's making. I mean, Carson Beck has had multiple 2+ interception games over the season, right? Will Howard's had his struggles, but Carson Beck in back-to-back games, one of which was the Texas game, by the way, he has 3 interceptions in back-to-back weeks, and also against that. So essentially, anytime Georgia has gotten on the field with like matchup games, Carson Beck has looked a little shaky. Will Howard's had moments, but I don't think overall we've had a game where it's like, just completely throughout the game, he's looked a little bit shaky in those situations. So that's the extent of it, right? I think we both came out of this thinking Ohio State should be 2, but wondering if the committee was going to go there. They did go there. And so I think as long as Ohio State and Oregon don't drop the ball over the next 4 weeks, we are all going to be sitting in Indianapolis on December 7th in that game is not only going to be for the Big Ten, I think it's going to be for the number one spot. And to your point about the Nebraska thing, they also mentioned the fact that other teams everybody's had their moment of not looking great. So it's how often, though. Consistency does matter. And more often than not, Ohio State has looked like the better team, even if us inside the bubble can get a little bit more nitpicky about things. This is what we have to do when we live inside this bubble. We get extremely, extremely nitpicky about things. So that's what it is. That's it. Ohio State and Oregon are 2-1. It's the third time in the college football playoff era that teams from the same conference have been number one and number two. 2017, Alabama and Georgia. They end up playing in the national championship game. 2021, Alabama and Georgia. They ended up playing in the national championship game. So I'm just saying, I jokingly tweeted this out a couple of weeks ago. I was like, so what if instead of doing all this, we just have Ohio State and Oregon play each other 2 more times, and whoever wins 2 of those 3 wins the national title? I'm just saying, if history repeats itself, the last 2 times, number 1 and number 2 were in the first rankings, they played the national championship game. So what if we get it? What if it happens? What if we get a third time's a charm situation? It's just the first rankings. We got 4 more of these before we get the real ones in December. But there it is. Get the text 614-350-3315. We were tweeting out, texting out. I'm sorry, we don't tweet this. We do tweet it out, but we text it first. We were texting out a lot of this information as it was happening, as we sat on a radio call, not a radio call, a phone call. What do you call those things nowadays? Because what is Zoom
teleconference?
Teleconference, yeah. Listen, that was back in our day. They do Zoom calls nowadays. A teleconference with Michigan AD Ward Manuel and CFB Director Rich Clark. I don't know if we'll go this deep on the podcast every week with it, because these matter because they're the initial rankings and it tells us how the committee is thinking. Going forward, it's a very simple. Ohio State keeps winning. They're going to hold on to that number 2 spot, and at worst maybe drop to 3 depending on who they're playing.
We'll see. I'm interested to see if Georgia, manhandles at Ole Miss this weekend, what it looks like, if that's enough. Because they had Ole Miss in the top 16, top 15, so it'll be interesting.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that because they've got Ole Miss and Tennessee back-to-back weeks. I also don't know if that Ole Miss win will hold long-term. Maybe the Tennessee one will. And so it almost becomes a conversation of Georgia's got Ole Miss and Tennessee left. Ohio State's got Indiana, who's got eye test written all over it. If Indiana is beaten its next 2 opponents before it gets on the field with Ohio State by 3 touchdowns, and Indiana's like 6 by the time we get to those rankings, I am wondering if the committee thinks that's stronger than Georgia having wins over an Ole Miss team who, as much as they're 16 right now, they're just as close to being like not in the rankings at all. So I am going to I'm going to keep my eye on that. I do expect Georgia to maybe jump Ohio State next week, but I also expect Ohio State to jump Georgia once again. I'm expecting this to be number 1 versus number 2 by the time it gets to Indianapolis. And that's what matters most in this situation because that tone was set in these first rankings. We're going to take a break here. And then we did talk with Ryan Day and Jim Knowles and Will Howard on Tuesday, long before these rankings came out, like 6 hours before the rankings came out. And so the rest of the pod will be about this. We're also going to put this part up on YouTube. So if you're watching on YouTube, go find the rest of the podcast. It's a fun time. And get the text, 614-350-3315. When we come back, Andrew will join us from the break on Buckeye Talk.